Well, so excited to talk to you. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I am hot, but good. Let's start the way I start all my interviews, which is you introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, what you do, and just for fun, tell us your all time favorite song.
Oh, that's a really hard question because in a former life, I was a musician, but so I have a lot of favorite songs. But my real job is and always has been as a children's wear designer, and I started my career in New York City, and I worked in women's wear, and and then I got into children's wear. So now I am the founder and owner and designer of a company called Bea Made, and it is expandable clothing for babies and toddlers that fits your child at least 3 times longer, which allows you to have way fewer children's clothes.
Sounds great to me. Kids grow so fast. Why keep buying clothes? Why not expand why not be smart on the front end and make clothes that expand and grow with your child? Makes complete sense to me. I've done a lot of episodes on the problems with the fashion industry, and those episodes tend to be geared towards adults, women's fashion in particular. Would you say that the problems, and we're going to get into the problems in a minute, but would you say that the problems with regard to children's fashion in particular are not as bad, worse, or just about the same as adult fashion?
I'm going to say worse because I think one of our biggest challenges as a society in the US is that we really do think of babies and children's clothing as disposable. I think as adults, when we buy fast fashion out of convenience or style or whatever, we're not really thinking that we're planning on throwing these clothes out. We may start out with good intentions, but I think with children's wear, we really kind of tend to expect that our children are going to trash them and that they're going to end up getting tossed. So I'm going to say worse because textile and fashion is like, I mean, if you've covered it before, it's the second most polluting industry on earth next to oil. So we really want to try and avoid throwing these things into the trash. And also because a lot of children's wear is made of plastic fibers. So, like polyester, spandex, acetate, microfiber, and that stuff doesn't break down. So I'm gonna vote for worse.
Okay, well, we need to back up because you didn't tell me your favorite song.
You're right. I forgot to tell you my favorite song because it was such a hard question. I'm just gonna have to go with an album. Is that okay? Anything from Joni Mitchell's Blue, I'm gonna say, would be a favorite.
Okay, good. Now we can successfully go back to the problems with kids wear. Well, I want to start today's conversation by taking a wide lens, a longitudinal lens, if you will. Let's talk about the history of kids' fashion. What did it used to look like? How did it change? And specifically, how did we get to where we are today, in which we buy kids' clothes? We're fine if they wear them once because they're often so cheap. We're fine if the kid never gets to wear them, and then we either discard of them or pass them on. How did we get here?
Well, if you're lucky enough, like I am, to have photos of your grandparents as children, you will notice that they are wearing white and they're all wearing dresses. So, as recently in history as our grandparents' generation, well, I'm sort of an old mom. So, my grandfather was born in the early 1900s, but I have great pictures of him and his brother and sister, and they're all wearing white dresses. And my grandfather was the oldest, and he was about 6 years old wearing a white dress. So, gendered fashion for children is like pretty much a 20th century invention. Before that, all children wore the same types of clothing and garments, and it was white. They wore the same types of garments being a dress because it was much easier for diaper changes. And it was white because it could be bleached easily. And back then, they didn't really have like the washing technology that we have now. So it was just much easier to wash everything and bleach it with when it was white fabrics. And so that started to change in the 20th century. It started with adding in pastel colors for babies, but most people don't know that pink was originally the color for boys and blue was for girls. And the thinking was that pink was sort of like a softer version of a stronger color like red. And that pink and the blue, pastel blue, was like the softer, more gentle color for girls. And obviously that over time flipped. But it started out like that. And then, as the Industrial Revolution happened and clothing began to be more mass produced in factories, that's when the shift really began to happen. So honestly, it was kind of like marketing created the split in gender dressing. And that sort of ebbed and flowed over time. With the rise of feminism, there was a move back towards gender neutral clothing. Like when I look at my baby pictures, I wore a lot of rainbows and yellow. And then in the 80s, when a couple of things started to happen, the technology evolved so that people could find out the gender of their child before the sex of their child before birth. And also that is when manufacturing started to move away from the United States and overseas where it could be produced more cheaply. So in order to sell you more clothing, they started to really heavily gender the clothes. It became a lot less expensive and people were more invested in it because they knew before the baby was even born what sex it would be.
Yes. I'm thinking back to my childhood and certainly my mother's childhood. My grandmother sewed and made an awful lot of my mother's clothes. So we're talking the 1950s. And then I'm an 80s baby. And my mom was and still is a menace on the sewing machine. She didn't make all my clothes by any stretch of the imagination, but she did make some. And my grandmother, a menace with some knitting needles. She knitted me more sweaters than I had time to wear, starting as an infant all the way up until I was too cool to wear them as a teenager. And so, do you have any thoughts on the transition from we're literally with our own hands infusing love into the clothes by making them, that transition to let's have them mass produced and buy them cheap?
Well, first of all, you're so lucky that you had that experience. I did too. My grandmother taught my mom to sew and she taught me to sew. And my grandmother used to make a lot of their clothes because my mom was a working mom. She didn't make a lot of mine, but they know, and anybody who sews knows that if you're going to go to the time and trouble to pour your heart into making a garment for a child, you want it to you want them to wear it for a long time. You don't want them to just outgrow it. So what I find so interesting is that the way the clothes were constructed changed because of that exact thing. When clothes were handmade, longevity was extremely important because the clothes, if you didn't make them yourself, you had to buy them and they were really expensive. So, when clothing became mass produced, that was so much less important. And, as most American mothers started to work, and it's at the point now where we really have to work in order to maintain any kind of standard of living, there's no time to do that. And so whatever is cheapest and most convenient is usually what we reach for first, either because that's our habit or because out of necessity, that's all we can do.
What I hear you saying there is that our way of acquiring or creating children's clothes have changed, but deeper than that is our values have changed. Pre-industrial revolution, well, not even pre-industrial revolution. I'm an 80s baby and things were different then when I was growing up. We cared for our stuff. We mended our stuff. I didn't mend them. I was a baby, but my mom mended stuff. We wanted to extend the longevity of these baby clothes for future babies, that we have for future babies, that our community has, our friends, our our aunts, uncles, etc. But these days, there's no caring for our stuff. There's no caring for the fast fashion. So talk to me about baby and young kid fashion. You call it an environmental train wreck. Why is it an environmental train wreck?
Yeah. So, it's interesting. When I started in children's wear, I worked for Carter's, which is the largest manufacturer of baby and toddler clothing, at least in the country, if not planet Earth. Their tagline, it's a very old company. It was established in the 1800s, but their tagline used to be, if only they could stay little until their Carters wore out, because the value of the brand was quality. Well, if you walk into any Carter's store now, you're not going to see that, because Carter's has become the quintessential fast fashion brand. I think you can buy PJs now for $4 in the holiday season, and they're all made of plastics. So, when I first got that job, it was exciting because it was like, oh, little cute little clothes and little characters, and it's fun and it's all on trend, and you get to make these babies look like little adults. It's so fun, but once I really got into it and realized what types of fabrics we were using, cotton, of course, but cotton is a really imperfect fiber. It's the most chemically treated crop on earth. It's very thirsty, meaning it takes a lot of water to grow. And it's often grown in countries that already suffer from water scarcity. And there's also an ethics problem with the labor force. So I'm sure, if you follow politics at all, you're familiar with the Uyghur people in China. They basically work as slave labor, and a lot of times they work in the cotton industry. So you can't really even be sure that the cotton clothes that you're buying was not made by people who have been enslaved. So that's a big deal. And then if it's not made of cotton, it's often made of, like I said earlier, plastic fibers. So polyester, spandex, all of that stuff is actually made from plastic pellets that are melted down and extruded through a machine that creates these long and strong, they actually are strong fibers. The problem is that they don't ever break down. And if children's clothing is made of plastic that is going pretty quickly into a landfill, that's a huge problem. And on top of that, the dyeing processes that we use create a lot of toxicity into our waterways because the dyes are very toxic.
Okay, so a lot of problems there. I must say, I have family members in my family who, Christmas comes around, a birthday comes around, and there are boxes and boxes filled with Carter's clothes. Carter's clothes are affordable. I get to suppose that would be the nicer way of saying inexpensive, cheap. And so then, on the other side of the spectrum would be buying the really expensive kids' clothes, maybe even like, dare I use the word designer clothes. That doesn't sound right to me either, because let's be real, they're kids. They don't care what they're wearing. They're going to stain it and ruin it anyway. So what's the best way, in your opinion? I think I know the answer, but what's the best way to clothe your child?
Yeah, I think designers are really not that much better, to be honest. The designer clothing is also made in overseas factories. I don't think most of them are particularly conscious of the materials or processes that they use. These days, it's hard to even tell what you can trust, because it just seems like every single thing is totally greenwashed, and organic fabric just doesn't mean much anymore. So, I only have one child, so that's sort of a unique situation. I don't have to think about siblings or anything like that, but I try to buy clothing the same way. The number one most sustainable thing that you can do is buy secondhand. So find, if you live in a city, find your reliable secondhand shop that you can always go to get what you need. And then, you're not always going to find exactly what you want. So obviously I started a company that was meant to fill that need, which is expandable clothes that are made of extremely durable, natural fibers that can be adjusted over time so your child can wear them longer. They're also unisex so that they can be shared between siblings, regardless of their sex. And they just last a lot longer. So, I don't think there are very many other brands that are doing that right now. So I wanted to fill a need in the market for parents who wanted something nice and something new, but really wanted something that they could trust. And I think it's also important to put the responsibility back in the hands of the consumer, because in terms of, organic and sustainable fashion, we're putting all of our eggs in the fabrication basket. We're expecting that the fabric is organically grown or sustainably created, but we're not thinking much about the way that we're going to use it. So as far as I'm concerned, an organic t-shirt or a regular t-shirt, if you're only going to wear it once or twice for 3 months and then pass it on, the difference is kind of negligible. What I'd really love to see people start doing is using their things more and buying, knowing that they're going to use them more. So yeah, go to the secondhand shop, but also look for the natural fibers. Look at the seams and see how they're constructed. Like, don't let cost be your number one driver of your purchase. Think about longevity if you can. It's obviously a luxury. Not everybody can do this, but if you can, just think twice. I mean, you're actually going to spend the same amount of money, because you're either going to buy 2 of something that won't last, or you're going to buy 1 of something that will.
You had alluded to looking at quality when shopping for kids' clothes. What does that mean? What should parents, what should grandparents, what should anybody who ever in the future is ever going to buy a children's outfit, what should they be looking for beyond the frills, beyond the adorableness of the thing in question?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned grandparents, because I think they can sometimes be the worst offenders about this, partly just from lack of knowledge on the topic, but also because I think they're just sort of helpless against especially the seasonal things. So the little Halloween shirts that have a jack-o'-lantern or a witch on them, the Christmas jammies, the things that you can literally only wear like 1 or 2 times. And then what are you going to do with it? No one else can wear it for the rest of the year either. It can only be worn once a year. So I would say, first of all, just avoid the seasonal things that can't actually be worn more than 1 or 2 times before they are outgrown. And then, especially for babies, when you're not necessarily sure what your family planning looks like, try to opt for things that are more unisex, because if you are going to have another child, obviously you do not know what sex they're going to be. And if you really want to get the most out of your clothing, like, it's good to choose things that your child can wear a long time, but it's even better to pass them on to a sibling. And so if it's important to you that you dress your child in a way that indicates their sex, which to a lot of people that's not important at all, but if it is, choose things that kind of fall right in the middle, so that they can be repurposed for another child. If you're not going to have another child, you can just find a neighbor or a friend or a relative that you can pass it on, and it won't matter what sex their child is either. So that's a big one. And then, fabrication, like I said, plastic fibers are actually pretty darn strong. So buying secondhand polyester, I would say, is not the biggest sin on earth. We probably do want to avoid that, just because those plastic fibers tend to shed into the water, like into your laundry, and that goes into the waterways. So I don't like plastic fibers for that reason, but you can buy mesh bags to wash them in, and you can put a filter. So that's solvable. But natural fibers just tend to be more sustainable, and they may not be quite as durable, but they're better for your child's skin for sure, and they're better for the environment. So natural fibers probably take precedence for me. And then you also want to look at the weight of the fabric. I really like twill. Twill is not a type of fiber, but it's a weave, and it's a really strong weave. So many pants are made out of twill, and you can recognize it because you know how like jeans, you can almost see there's like a diagonal, teeny tiny diagonal like stripe to the weave. That's a twill. So twills are really, really durable. So if you can find things like that are made of twill, that's great. I love linen in the warmer months because it's 30% stronger than cotton. It's extremely sustainable because it actually doesn't really require much. It doesn't require any pesticide and it survives on rainwater. So it's just a great sustainable fabric and it's extremely durable. Most people get a little confused about how to care for it. You actually don't have to do anything special except just don't put it in the dryer because it'll shrink. So you can wash it with the rest of your stuff and then just hang it up. And because it's so lightweight, it dries really quickly. So I love linen. And then actually take the time to like inspect the inside of the garment. You can see if there are any like buttons hanging loose. You can see if threads are loose or coming apart. And that's going to make a big difference because if it's already falling apart, I mean, a lot of fast fashion is falling apart at the store, you know? So take a look at the inside and just make sure that it looks like it's well constructed and isn't already coming apart. That may seem like a no-brainer, but I don't think most people do look inside. You know, you just grab it off the rack and you're ready to go. And you find out later when it's too late.
Especially because unless you have an older child, they're not going to be trying the item on in the store. That's when I think the falling apart becomes evident, right? When you're stretching it, pulling on the zipper, buttoning it up. That's when the snags, so to speak, in the design or in the manufacturing really become evident. With baby and young kids clothes, you're just buying by size, you're buying by cuteness, and you're buying by price. But what I hear you saying is let's go a little bit deeper. Let's be a little bit more intentional or conscious in our clothes consumption. I want to talk to you really quickly again about grandparents or aunts and uncles. I did mention them, and then you mentioned that they are perhaps the worst offenders. How do you have any tips for gently, nicely, respectfully helping grandparents and other relatives step away from the cheap children's fast fashion? Like, how do you convey a different way to them?
I'm going to be honest, I haven't figured it out myself because I like to joke that my mother is completely helpless against the like sale rack at Costco and she still to this day will bring home ridiculous outfits for my daughter. And every time I'm like, this is probably made by enslaved people. I am a literal eco children's wear designer. Like, I cannot believe that you did this. And much of the time I make her take it back. So I haven't figured that out for myself. I mean, I think everybody has a different relationship with their parents. This can be a touchy subject because they really are just trying to help. But just try to be honest with them and tell them what you're trying to do and tell them why. I mean, honestly, you know, you kind of hate to talk about the climate crisis, which I actually call a mass extinction because that's what it really is. It's hard to talk about that next to baby clothes, which should be a very happy subject. But this is the number one most challenging problem our children's generation will face. Like, literally nothing could be more important for their health and their safety than taking care of the planet. And considering how bad fast fashion is for the environment, it's kind of like the easiest thing you can do and just avoid that stuff. So, you know, maybe like if they want to be involved, like tell them the brands that you do like and say, you know, what would be really meaningful to me is a gift card from this place. You know, I don't know that that's going to be effective, but give them options. You know, it's like, that's how you deal with your toddlers, right? Give them choices. Give your parents choices too.
Tell us, Laurel, where my listeners can peruse your designs online.
Yeah, the site is beamade.com, and that's spelled BEYAMADE.com. And then I'm also on social media at Beamade, spelled the same way. Wherever you can find people on social media, I'm in all the places.
Well, Laurel, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, giving us a history of kids fashion. It was an enlightening conversation. So I wish you so much success. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This was a treat.